Well, thank you all for coming. I am here tonight to talk about inclusive UX research, and I'm not really sure how much of the group, how many of you identify as researchers versus designers versus strategists versus maybe people in related fields like project management or product management, business analysis, any of that kind of marketing, those sorts of things. But we're happy to have you. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. I'll try to answer them. I'll certainly say maybe if we're getting to that, but I don't want to move on too much if something isn't clear. So I did say I would introduce myself. I have been in the field for, depending how you count, almost 25 years. And in that time, I've worked for a variety of large and small, public and private companies, consulting firms, agencies, and then 14 years ago, I started my own practice. And I have worked for some really great clients in that area. My side gig, because we all have to have one, right, is a innovative bed linen product that I invented and for which I was awarded a patent in January. So on my side, in my free time, I'm working to bring that product to market. So ask me about that offline. I can talk, of course, about the bed linens for Infinity. Okay, so picture it. You're buying a ticket to a concert or sporting event, or you need to sign up for some certification class. And you have, what seems like a really straightforward sign up form. And you go to fill it out and life is great until you get to this gender question. And statistically, most of us are male or female, but a number of us are not strictly male or female. And for those people, the only option is prefer not to say. So what does that really, sorry, I'm going to switch views here. What does that really mean, right? When these are our options. All right, I'm going to new share, basic. Better, can you still see this?
The same for me.
Yeah, that looks good.
All right, so ruin my punchline. Actually, I would love to tell you what my gender identity is, but you haven't given me the chance to do that. Instead, you've just erased me again, right? In a very microaggressive way, right? There was no malice intended necessarily. There was no thought really, I guess, given to that, because for many people, this is just the default. There's a binary and maybe I just don't want to tell you. I'm going to accommodate non-binary people in this one way. So these are the kind of things that we don't want to happen. And what are all the things we need to think about and do to make sure that we're not causing these microaggressions, right? And hurting people in this way. And I'll give my disclaimer that I am a cis, straight, white woman of financial privilege in general in the world. And so many of these things don't apply to me, but we will get into some factors that still do, right? And it's not a matter of degree, but I definitely wanted to give that disclaimer and make space for anyone who feels that they need some representation during this call as well. So what do we know about inclusive experiences and inclusive products? They're good for business, right? Let's get straight to the point. There's a whole market of racial minorities, ethnic minorities, gender minorities, people with sexual orientation minorities, other culturally underrepresented groups, people of low socioeconomic status who have money to spend. Even the people of low socioeconomic status have money to spend. And making sure we include them is just good for our business, right? So we can access new markets when we do this. We can improve are experiences for everybody in what is commonly known as the curb cut effect, right? Which has some downsides as well because of reasons, but it is something that can be helpful. It helps us attract and retain talent when we are trying to hire. I mean, certainly it's sort of a employer's market right now in the UX world, at least it feels that way, but in other places it's not, right? And people are in high demand and people are looking for organizations that walk the walk, right, around DEI. Obviously, there are some legal quagmires you can get into if you make mistakes in this area. So we want to avoid that. And then fixing these things after the fact gets really expensive versus thinking of it beforehand, right? Anybody who's worked here in UX research or design, we know we want to front load all that stuff so that we can, design it in. Accessibility is not something you add at the end. It's something you build into the code, right? If you just looking at that one form field for gender, right? If we launched that and now we have to go back and change it, we don't just have to change the form, like the front end code, right? We have to change the database that's storing that information. We have to change all the systems that call that information from the database, right? It's a huge snowball effect that comes into play. For example, right, there are more than 100 studies showing that captioning a video helps a lot of people besides the ones you think about when you're talking about captioning, right? You think about people with hearing impairments, severe hearing impairments, but it's great for people who are learning a second language, people who are learning how to read, as well as the people who are deaf and hard of hearing, people in loud environments, right? People who maybe are in quiet environments, but don't want everyone to know that they're watching a video, right? I get to watch about 3 seconds of video before one of my kids is like, what are you watching? I'm like, nothing you should be watching, child. So these are things that help everyone. Legal troubles, this also falls in the accessibility category. Of the top 500 e-commerce retailers, 74% had been sued over digital accessibility issues in the last few years. And this, of course, is now 2 years old, but 14% were sued in the first half of 2021 alone. And they're going for big companies. That's the top 500. I read a rant from a smaller e-commerce provider who was upset because they had been sued and ended up like spending tens of thousands of dollars that they didn't really have, right? It was not a huge company. It was a company, that was a couple of months plus worth of profit for them probably. And of course they thought it was all unjust, but if you looked, like, the photos didn't have alt text, like the most basic accessibility things were not met. And yeah, just responding to the letters and the lawsuits costs a lot of money. So how do we build these inclusive experiences that gain us all this business and save us all these headaches? Well, it starts with user research, right? Diverse primary research is critical. And the W3C points out that knowledgeable human evaluation is required to determine if a site is accessible for people with disabilities. So all your wave checkers and all of those little automated things get you a certain amount of distance toward, having your accessible site, but you do need to test it with people with disabilities, people who are using assistive technology. And that applies as well to these other underinvested groups we've been talking about. We can't pretend, right, that the people we talk to, the people in our research studies, have behaviors, attitudes, and experiences. Their mental model is built on the scaffold of their identities, right? Things that, how they interact with the world and with society. And a lot of this for those underserved groups, for these minority groups, is rooted in a need for safety. So even though your conscious brain says, I'm sitting at my computer, I'm just browsing the web or using an app on my phone, I'm not in danger, right? But their mental model is built around assessing their safety constantly. So if there's this little thing that makes that hints that they're not accepted, or they're not, they're not, this space is not for them, this app is not for them, that's going to start to tickle the back of their brain, right? And so that's one bar, right? That's the minimum bar. We don't want them to feel scared, but helping them feel seen and feel included as opposed to not excluded is a whole nother level. And as we talk about these identities, right, it's a lot more things. The easy ones to think of, the frequent ones people think of are disabilities, physical, mental, cognitive. There is race and gender, sexual orientation, those sorts of things. But there are a lot of other components, right, that we talk about. Besides ability, gender identity, there's religion. There was a group in Maine, a hospital in Maine, that found out a large portion of their female Muslim population was not seeking healthcare because the hospital gowns were too immodest, and they were so uncomfortable that they did not get preventative health checkups. So they worked to source more modest, is the word I'm looking for, hospital gowns, and increase the number of people who were coming to seek healthcare with them, which of course is the right thing to do. It benefits the community, also benefited their bottom line, right? Outside of religion, there are cultural aspects, education levels, education types, what sort of career track you're on, certainly socioeconomic status, geography. I spent the last 2 weeks in the South, came back to the Mid-Atlantic. It's a very different environment, right? I did a study for an automotive company, for Hyundai, several years ago, and we had this prototyped car. We had this dashboard, it was all tricked out. And we went to San Jose and we went to Boston, and it was all these things like, can you set the radio? Can you turn on the windshield wipers? Can you, reply to this text message that's being read over, text to speech? And one of them was turning on the defroster on the windshield. And no one in San Jose knew what that icon meant, right? And everybody in Boston knew what the icon meant, but the Bay Area just had such mild weather that it wasn't part of their easy mental model. So it's not necessarily an exclusionary thing, but it does create friction, right, for people in some geographies more than others. Language barriers, health barriers, immigration status, right? Am I going to go to the hospital if it means I'm going to get deported? What am I going to tell you about these things? And then the digital divide, people's ability, their bandwidth, right? My mother-in-law has satellite internet, and if it's cloudy, she can't get online. Right? So if that's the only way she can do something, it's a problem. She's got to wait till the next day. Hopefully there wasn't a deadline, all of those sorts of things. I did some consulting recently for a large healthcare system, and we were talking about online scheduling. And in this workshop with maybe 30 people, they decided collectively that the patient's biggest problem this group needed to solve was that people couldn't cancel and reschedule their appointments online easily. Now, we've all sought healthcare. Probably many of us have tried to make appointments online. Is that the biggest barrier you have? Is that the biggest point of friction you have? I know it's not for me. And I know, because I have done research for this company for many years, that their patients are not worried about that. They're worried about money. They want to know, how much is this going to cost? Which is different from, do you take my insurance, right? Which is another whole level of things. But what's important about this is who this group was, right? By definition, they were professionally employed at one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. Probably everyone in that room had six-figure salaries. A good number of them, into the $200,000-$300,000 a year point. 75% were male, who statistically are not making healthcare decisions in the United States for families. And all of them had employer-sponsored group health insurance with one of the largest healthcare systems in the country. So it was not at all, cost is not a factor for that group, largely, right? They get an ear infection, they go to the doctor. They don't get an ear infection and say, can I squirt some Bactine in there and maybe not have to go to the doctor? You know, that's not part of their worldview. So if they do not include a larger population in their research, they're not going to understand this stuff. That's why I understood that, right? Because I had talked to different people who didn't look like them. Geography, here's another story out of Thailand that there were some socio-environmental and workflow factors that were geographically specific that caused this AI-assisted diabetic retinopathy screening tool, right, to fail. I mean, diabetic retinopathy is a big problem, people losing their vision. I did a study for another group, another organization that had an image and it was like a celebration, right? We're just festive was what they were going for. And the image they chose was people clinking glasses, right? And one of the participants said, I am an alcoholic. Like I am a regular AA attendee. I don't want to see that. I don't appreciate that in their thing. So just that one thing could say, you know, you shouldn't be here. That's not what we want. Inclusion, of course, also covers intersectionalities. People are not just a race or a gender or a socioeconomic status. They are some combination of all of those things and more. 68% of non-binary adults also fall into this low socioeconomic status area. 59% of Black Americans say religion is very important to them, substantially different than the 40% overall across adults. About 40% of LGBT adults are also people of color. So they're not one or the other, they're both. You know, I gave my rundown. I'm cis, straight, white. And, you know, I have my own religious status. I have my own geographical status. I have my own educational status, right? Financial, all those things. And then LGBT identification, younger people much more likely to embrace this self-identification than older people. I don't have a stat for it, but also urban populations are far more willing to self-identify as LGBT than those in rural areas, for reasons we can probably all guess. And these numbers are just going up, right? So this is the US Census 2010 versus 2020. They have this diversity index sort of Z-score that they calculate. So if you just kind of squint, you can see the map on the right is more green than the map on the left, which is showing how these things are increasing. Racial diversity increasing 5.2 percentage points between 2010 and 2020. In just the 3 years between 2017 and 2020, the number of Americans self-identifying as LGBT increased by 1.1 percentage points. Just feels like a small percentage, but it's also a very short period of time, right? Religious identity changing freaky rapidly. So this graph is 2007 to 2021. So over 14 years, the ratio, right, of Christians to the nuns, right, which is people atheist, agnostic, otherwise non-religiously affiliated, changed from 5-to-1 to just 2-to-1. Right? This is a big drop. This is a big gain, and other religions mostly stayed the same. So that I think is really interesting. Your organization, great. What do we do with all of this, right? I want to make sure the products I build, the research I do, the teams I'm on are inclusive. If you don't follow Vivian Castillo, you absolutely should. She has founded an organization called Humanity Centered. They do a number of online programs, webinars, courses. They recently opened up a discussion community, you know, to everyone. It is paid mostly so that they can fund scholarships for people who can't pay, right? But it's also very accessible. They practice what they preach. They're not going to price these underserved populations out of the support that they get in this group, right? But yes, we can do better. At the IAA conference 2 weeks ago, someone said, how do well-meaning people create unequal systems? We're all well-meaning. None of us wants to create these exclusionary systems and tools and products, but we do, in spite of sometimes our best efforts. So we can get or be, if you are at a high level, an executive sponsor. Modify and standardize your recruiting screeners, and we'll go into all of these in more detail. Remove participation barriers for people who need them. Normalize representation in all of your work, right? We talked about the recruiting, the participants, but not so much some other things. Having inclusive teams is critically important, right? And then make sure you track your progress. Finally, emphasize too that when you're asking screener questions, make sure they're optional, right? Don't force people to self-identify as some way or another. Just let them move on if they want to. So get or be an executive sponsor. When leadership provides an example, it helps keep these efforts from being dismissed. A lot of times the tactical team members, the individual contributors, sometimes at the very lowest levels, are the ones saying, hey, maybe we should add a I prefer to self-identify option on the gender question rather than just having male, female, or I prefer not to answer. And it just gets lost, right? At some point that's deemed less important than other priorities, right? But if leadership is going to hold you to it, right? If the team knows that I'm going to come back and ask you, how's this going to affect people in the LGBT community? How's this going to affect the Black community? How's this going to affect our customers who are transgender? Then there'll be more attention will be paid to them, right? Anything management helps you emphasize. Inclusive teams help you have inclusive products. They catch all that stuff that you don't, I as a cis straight white woman don't know what I don't know about being a trans woman, right? I don't know where these sort of things might affect people. I can certainly think about it and do my best, but I really, it's not going to be the same, right? People in these communities know the sort of common issues that come up and make sure, I mentioned that healthcare group, right? By default, none of them are going to be poor, right? They're all professionally employed. So that wasn't really a possibility for them, but they certainly could have had, more minorities in the room. They could have had more women in the room. They could have had more people who maybe had lived in poverty at one point in their life, right? And had come out of it to provide some of that perspective. We had another finding with that group where if you're trying to find a doctor, a different group of individuals, but the same organization, if you're trying to find a doctor in the system, you can search for cardiologist or family practice or whatever, but then you can filter those results, right, with a faceted search. And language is one of the filter criteria. I need a doctor who speaks Spanish. I need a doctor who speaks, Gujarat. And all of the research we did showed that this was not an important field, right? It was good. We needed it, right? But it wasn't a frequently used field. And of course it did, because we only did research with English speaking participants because we were English speaking moderators. And at the most we could do at that point was recognize it, right? And say, hey, this data is not valid because our resource pool is not, balanced, right? Our participant pool. And hopefully, bring that in more. I know that hospital system has a number of hospitals in Texas. So, they definitely have that Spanish language issue that, it's going to come up everywhere, but Texas, of course, has a larger proportion of only Spanish speaking population than some other places. So I don't want to belabor that point too much. So how do you identify blind spots when you don't know you have them? Yeah, you don't. I would love for someone, and maybe it's someone here, to create some sort of checklist or index to say, have you considered X, Y, and Z, similar to the WCAG guidelines, right? I wouldn't think a lot of things about accessibility without that, but I would like to see that for a more inclusive group. I think that's helpful. And we'll get to measurement in just a minute. So I'll say right now your recruiting screeners and your recruiting requirements are probably like aim for an even mix of gender identities, right? Or aim for broad representation of racial identities, right? But that's not really, how often does that work out, right? I had a study last year where I said, I need, at least 2 people with only a high school education. And the recruiter kept bringing me none. And they're like, well, it's really hard to find. And I'm like, well, that's your job, find one, find 2. You're supposed to find 2. You agreed to find 2, find me 2. So yeah, don't just ask for a mix of racial identities. Say, I need 3 to 5 Black or African-American participants in this study. And then when your recruiter comes back with 1, you say, no, I need 3 to 5, right? You have to hold them to that. But you also have to know to ask for it. And then standardizing the screeners, when we get into measurement, we'll talk about that a tiny bit more. But it's hard to track how you are improving the diversity of your participant pool if you're comparing like gender question A to gender question B, right? They kind of need to be the same to do that. Designing with, not for, these excluded communities is how we put the inclusive in inclusive design. This book, Mismatch by Kat Holmes, is excellent. I could pull a quote from it for every slide almost, but I do recommend it if you get to. Again, make sure they know these questions are optional. The UK government site has a great set of guidelines too on how to ask those questions, right? Not just in recruiting screeners, but in, when you're registering, do I need to ask your gender? When you're registering to take a course, like, I don't really care if you're male or female if you take my course, unless you're trying to track those metrics. So explaining why you're asking this question, right? And why it's important helps people feel safer about answering it. Now, I mean, whether they believe you or not is another question, but I think if they're optional and you could say, we're doing this to make sure we have equal representation or, sufficient representation from all groups in our research or in our customer base or so on and so forth. Participation barriers. If you think about someone who is in this excluded, underserved category for whatever reason, it's harder for them to participate in your research. If they need childcare, right? They can't just get away for an hour or 2 to go participate in your research. They can't even necessarily like lock themselves in their home office, right? That they don't have. They're going to be in a loud environment. They're going to have chaos around them. Their schedule, they don't work often. I'll make some generalities in my commentary, but I always mean some, right? Many of these people, they do shift work. Some are working 2 or 3 shifts at a time, holding down multiple jobs just to try to make ends meet. So they're not necessarily going to be able to fit into your really neat research schedule, right? I always want to do my research 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and make it great. But if I want these underserved populations in my research, I need to be open to working with their schedule instead of expecting them to work with my schedule. They may need more money. If you have an in-person study, you really need to think about parking. You really need to think about transportation, right? They don't have a car. Maybe they're taking the bus and it's going to take them 2 hours to travel to your location and 2 hours to travel back plus bus fare. So send a Lyft for them. Make that stuff happen. More and more, we're doing remote research, of course, but here too, we've got participation barriers, not necessarily because of technical literacy or digital divide, but that is a factor. If you want to do a study with my mother-in-law, it's going to be hard. It's slow. It's slow to screen share with her over this satellite internet in the middle. She's in rural Missouri. Literally, if you look at like the cell phone coverage maps and they're zoomed out so that the whole country is like 2 inches wide, you can still see a little hole in the middle of Missouri where she lives, right? That's how little connectivity she and my father-in-law have. So it's really difficult to get those people doing that. And then people in the trades tend not to use screen sharing tools as much as knowledge workers do, right? So if that is a population you want to include in your research, you're going to have to explain how to use Zoom. You're going to have to explain how to use Google Meet. You're going to have to explain what to click to share your screen, right? So allocate a little more time for that technical troubleshooting at the beginning. But it is harder on us, harder on the research team, but it's worth it. Normalize representation. In planning and reporting, make the exclusion evident. Make it clear, make it obvious. You can use icons, you can use, make sure your stock photos, right, are diverse. There are a bajillion sources of Black women in tech, people with disabilities, people in all kinds of environments, right? All kinds of racial identities, plenty of, people who would code, right, as sort of alternative or non-binary, and those sorts of things. When they're just in your deliverables, then the next time someone sees a deliverable with all 40-year-old white men, it's going to look weird. It's, in a way that it didn't maybe 10 years ago, because that is what we all saw. And it just kind of, that's what we expected. So use representative photos, avoid stereotypical images. If you're working with teachers, maybe be sure to include some men, right, in that teacher group, instead of just following the stereotype that teachers are women or nurses are women or doctors are men, right? Or bankers, lawyers, whatever the factor is, right? There was a study a few years ago, right, that kids who were asked to draw a scientist were suddenly drawing more women scientists, whereas a few years before it was almost exclusively men that they drew as scientists. So these things matter. Or alternatively, you could just say, I can't get a representative set of images to use here, so I'm just not going to use images, right? Maybe I'll put a field of poppies in there to add some visual interest instead of people photos, right? Just today, I delivered a prototype that I had to indicate, on the static prototype that people would pinch to zoom. And I made an intentional choice to make this hand sort of a mid-tone flesh tone instead of a white hand or a black hand or whatever. I wanted the team to see that so that it would click one extra, notch in the back of their head that, hey, not everyone who's using our system is white, right? And this is designed for doctors and nurses. So there are some other assumptions we can make about, for example, education or income level. But yeah, a lot of these people are different colors. And I only had one. This is the only thing in this tool because it's just like wireframes, right? There were no people photos. So even if you just have one, you're making a decision, when you do this. You have to pick something. I could have made it, I don't know, purple, I guess, but take advantage of those opportunities to make those things. We talked about tracking progress. You want to keep note of those research participation identity metrics. Being thoughtful about how you ask for them is still along those same lines of explaining why you're asking. Don't require them to answer. Coming out and saying, hey, are you transgender is not a way to help people feel safe in a digital space. Over time, though, note how well or poorly certain groups are represented in your research. You know, how many out of all the people we talked to this year, how many Black people did we talk to, right? How many gay men did we talk to? How many poor people did we talk to? However we define that number, right? And then the coolest thing is to have researchers make note of which findings were really specifically linked to individuals or groups. So to be able to say, we found this because the 3 Black people in our study brought it to our attention, and none of the white people said it, and we wouldn't have thought of it. And so it was really important that we did this, right, to help build that case. Megan Campos, formerly of MadPow, now at Fidelity, I think, has a story where she was doing some research on healthcare in Massachusetts, and it was like Medicare, Medicaid, and there was a lot in there about from the Black participants who said, I need to go to a Black doctor because, right, they'll listen to me. They won't just decide I'm seeking drugs. They won't just decide I'm poor and eat, you know, fried chicken every day, or whatever stereotype that they were having applied to them. I'll say again, the same healthcare company I was working at, we have a race filter in that same physician search, and the cis, straight, white, middle-aged vice president of design and research was appalled, because to him, filtering by race was making sure you didn't get a Black doctor, right? That was his mental scenario of like, oh my God, you can filter by race, and this is bad for the Black doctors, is how he was seeing it. And he was appropriately appalled, right, that someone would only seek out a white or male, doctor. But he didn't see it, right? He didn't see for those Black patients that they needed a doctor who would listen to them. They needed a doctor who wouldn't dismiss them. As a woman, I do look for doctors who aren't going to just tell me it's all in my head, or I'm crazy, or, it's your period, whatever it is. I think those are important things to think about. Key Lime Interactive is a consultancy out of Miami. They do a lot of research and strategy work, and they are developing, they're close to finish something they call the Inclusivity Index. And they have developed a standard set of screener questions, which are available online I think if you go to Key Lime Interactive and just click DEI, the Inclusivity Index is right there. There's like V1.0 documentation there that you can sign up for. But what this does is allows you to enter the information about your research participants, and they will tell you based on information from the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Pew Research Center, a number of sources, right? Not just the Census Bureau, how well or poorly your participant mix matches the population of the United States as a whole. Now, there are limits to that, right? If your product is used exclusively in the Pacific Northwest, maybe you don't want to compare your research to the participants as a whole, or to the country as a whole, right? If your product is international, this right now is only US based, but I think it's a great start. They have the primary things they index are race, ethnicity, gender, and disability, but they also track or they allow for the tracking of age, LGBTQIA status, things like that. I had a great call with them recently about why they do what they do, but in the end you get based on how many standard deviations away you are from the average, you are either at index, right? So your research population is approximately the same gender mix as the US as a whole, or it's progressively indexed. So your research population in this instance is more racially and ethnically diverse than the population as a whole, so here, for example, Black participants are represented at 23% compared to the US average of 12.4%. Middle East and North Africa, 3% as opposed to 1% of the US population. And the idea there, of course, is that you're doing the hard work to counteract this bias toward the majority. And then under indexed where you are, your population pool is lower than the country as a whole. So I would recommend that you check that out. It is not publicly available yet. Right now it's just a Google sheet, but it's still I think it's going in a really interesting direction. And I mean, saves you from making your own, basically. And then being able to see, you'll still have your data. So you can say, okay, well, maybe, the US average for Black participants is 12.4%. Last year we had 3%. This year we have 7%, right? It's still under, but we're improving. Maybe not as fast as we'd like, maybe not as much as we'd like, but it's getting there. So that I think is a great tool. It's open source. It will be open source with attribution, or I guess that makes it Creative Commons, but it's free. And finally, what you can do to make sure your product is more inclusive is when you're called out, as for example, when this person said, hey, Mural, your org chart template has all these figures coding as male, except a few females all in support roles, right? And of course, this is just a Twitter call out. It was an official letter to the company, but they said, hey, thanks for letting us know. They should all be neutral. We're going to update it. We apologize. And thank you for letting us know, right? I think we all know, and look, Anne feels listened to, heard, seen, respected. She's going to stick with Mural if they actually follow through and fix this, right? It's been over a year, so I want to check, but I think we all know companies who would go the other way and say, oh, thanks for letting us know. But of course, they're there for you to replace those figures, right? Or, we all know any figure could have any gender, right? Any position on this org chart, and just said, it's not really that big of a deal. But representation matters, and Mural recognized that when they were called out on it. And I think that was hugely important. That's my notes about the inclusivity index tool. This is a little bit about my company, if you want a little bit more info about us. It's mostly me, and I bring in a lot of partner practitioners for either, subspecialty, like accessibility, I know sort of just enough to be dangerous, and or industry specific things, but that is it.